Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell before we begin. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing while you're listening to this history video. On the 24th of January, 41 AD, the Roman world shuddered and then held its breath. In the dimly lit corridors of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, the unimaginable had finally happened. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the emperor known to the troops and to history as Caligula, lay dead on the marble floor. He was a ruin of 30 sword wounds delivered by his own Praetorian Guard. For the first time since the rise of Augustus, the throne was empty. The beast was slain, and the tyranny was seemingly over. In that electric vacuum of power, the Roman Senate did something it hadn't dared to do in decades. It dreamed. The consuls, Sentius Saturninus and Pomponius Secundus, didn't flee, nor did they weep for the fallen ruler. Instead, they ordered the battalions of the urban cohorts to seize the forum. They convened the Senate not in the Julian Curia, a building that bore the hated name of the emperor's family, but in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. This was the sacred high-ground citadel of the ancient republic. There, amidst the smell of incense and the looming statues of the gods, they spoke of liberty. They debated erasing the memory of the Caesars entirely. They spoke of a world where the Senate would once again command the legions, and the magistrates would rule by law, not by whim. For a few delirious hours, it seemed that the clock had been turned back 70 years. The Republic was alive. But while the senators were getting drunk on their own rhetoric, the real city, the sprawling, brawling, hungry city of Rome, was making a different calculation. Down in the streets, the news of Caligula's death didn't bring cheers of liberation. It brought panic. The shops closed. The mob gathered in the forum, not to support the Senate, but to demand to know who would feed them. And in the Praetorian camp on the edge of the city, the soldiers weren't debating political theory. They were looting the palace, where they found Claudius, the trembling middle-aged uncle of the dead emperor, hiding behind a curtain. They didn't kill him. They hauled him out, hailed him as imperator, and declared he would now rule. By the next morning, the Senate's restoration had evaporated like mist. The consuls found themselves without an army, and the people were shouting for Claudius. The dream of the Republic died not with a bang, but with a vote of submission. The Senate formally conferred all imperial powers upon Claudius, confirming a harsh truth that would define the next 3 centuries. The Senate was a theater of dignity, but the emperor, and more than ever, elements of the military, were the reality of power. To understand why the Senate looked so powerful but felt so weak, we must return to the architect of the empire, Augustus. When Augustus emerged from the carnage as emperor, he faced a paradox. He had absolute power, won by the sword, but he knew that displaying naked power was a death sentence. Julius Caesar had acted like a king and died for it. Romans of all social classes were united under a single sincere foundational belief: Romans would never again be ruled by kings. Augustus was smarter. He realized that the Roman elite didn't necessarily need to rule, but they desperately needed to feel like they were ruling. Augustus created the Principate, a system of government that was essentially a monarchy masquerading as a republic. He famously claimed in his Res Gestae, his posthumous autobiography inscribed on bronze columns across the empire, that he had restored the republic. He handed the state back to the Senate and the people. He refused the title of dictator. He sat in the Senate House as merely the princeps senatus, or first man of the Senate, voting just like everyone else. It was a brilliant lie. By preserving the Senate, Purifying its membership and treating it with exaggerated respect, Augustus co-opted the aristocracy. He made the senatorial class accomplices in his regime. The Senate continued to meet, elect magistrates, and pass decrees which, over time, acquired the full force of law, replacing the cumbersome popular assemblies. To a casual observer, the dignity of the Roman state was intact. The genius of this system lay in the Roman legal distinction between potestas, meaning constitutional power, and auctoritas, meaning influence or moral authority. Augustus claimed he had no more potestas than his colleagues, but excelled everyone in auctoritas. For the Senate, the equation was inverted. In terms of legal power, the Senate was theoretically the source of all law, and it also governed peaceful provinces. The emperor held the maius imperium, or greater power, which allowed him to override any governor in any province. He held the tribunicia potestas, or tribunician power, which gave him the right to veto the Senate and protected his person as sacrosanct. The Senate could debate, but it could only decide what the emperor allowed it to decide. This created a psychological split within the Senate. Senators were trapped in a peerage of servitude. They were men of vast wealth and ancient lineage who had to pretend to be free while knowing that a single frown from the princeps could end their careers or their lives. As Tacitus, himself a senator, bitterly observed, the nobility had been raised to wealth and high office by their propensity for servitude. We often assume that because the Senate stood for the Republic, the common people must have missed the Republic too. This is a modern projection. If you were a cobbler living in a third-floor apartment in the Subura, Rome's crowded working-class district in 20 AD, your reality was different. You had no memory of a free republic, and what you were likely told about was about chaos. The last century of the Republic had been a nightmare for the common people. It was a time when rival warlords like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar turned the streets of Rome into battlefields. It was a time of fire, famine, and gang violence. The Senate, in the eyes of the plebs, wasn't the guardian of liberty. It was the guardian of the optimates, the ultra-rich oligarchy that had consistently blocked land reform, opposed grain subsidies, and killed champions of their rights. When the Senate spoke of libertas, the people heard privilege. They heard the freedom of the rich to exploit the poor. The emperors, by contrast, positioned themselves as the heirs of the populares. They were the champions of the little guy. By taking the title of tribune of the plebs, the emperor signaled that he was the protector of the plebs against the predation of the ultra-rich senatorial class. The most critical factor in the common people's assessment of the Senate was food. Rome was a monster of a city, consuming 150,000 tons of grain a year. Under the Republic, the job of feeding the city fell to the aediles, young senators climbing the political ladder. They frequently failed. Grain prices fluctuated wildly, controlled by hoarding merchants and corrupt senators. Augustus changed the game. He took personal responsibility for the grain supply, the cura annii. Crucially, he took the management of this out of the hands of the Senate and gave it to a praefectus annii, a professional administrator from the equestrian class. This was a class of people below senators, often referred to in older sources as knights, that often engaged in more conventional businesses. The result was a stable, state-subsidized, and later free grain dole. To the common people, this was the primary justification for the empire. The Senate gave speeches, the emperor gave bread. This dynamic was brutally illustrated under Claudius. When a series of bad harvests caused a grain shortage, the mob didn't march on the Senate house. They found Claudius in the forum and pelted him with stale crusts of bread. They held him responsible because they knew he held the power. The Senate was irrelevant to the issue of survival. The shift from aediles to prefects was the single most important factor in breaking the bond between the Senate and the people. The Senate lost the power of the purse and the power of the pantry simultaneously. There was also a darker, more cynical reason the people preferred the emperor: entertainment, and not just gladiators. The common people enjoyed the spectacle of the Senate being humbled. For centuries, the senatorial class had strutted through Rome, demanding the right of way, flaunting their wealth, and treating the commoners with disdain. Now, the people watched as these same aristocrats were forced to bow and scrape before the emperor. Caligula, for all his madness, was often cheered by the mob because he humiliated the Senate. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot. He made scions of ancient families wait on his table. To the man in the street, this was a grim form of justice where the high and mighty were finally getting a taste of their own medicine. But if we want to know what the people thought, we can't just read modern histories derived from a study of ancient sources that were written by people from the senatorial class. We actually have the words of common people, written in their own hand without any filters. The graffiti of Pompeii and Herculaneum preserves the voice of the Roman street. The evidence suggests a profound lack of reverence. While official inscriptions praise the Senate and people of Rome, the graffiti is far more interested in gladiators, barmaids, and local gossip. When politics is mentioned, it's often cynical, saying something along the lines of, "Pickpockets support this candidate for the Senate." The charade that the Senate chose the emperor and held the ultimate legal authority came crashing down in 69 AD. This was a shambolic mess known to history as the Year of the Four Emperors. After Nero's untimely end, the empire collapsed into civil war. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian were all proclaimed emperor by their troops in the provinces, in Spain, on the Danube, on the Rhine, and in Judea. The Senate in Rome was reduced to a rubber stamp. When Galba approached Rome, the Senate declared him emperor and declared Nero a public enemy. When Otho slew Galba a few months later, the Senate declared Otho emperor and Galba a public enemy. When Vitellius defeated Otho, the Senate pivoted again. This is the moment that the fig leaf of senatorial control completely fell off, giving all Romans full view of how the sausage was really made. And yeah, as I'm recording this, I think I could have chosen a better mix of metaphors, but I'm going with it. Tacitus famously wrote that the secret of empire was revealed, that an emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome at the Senate. While this may not shock us modern people, this was a psychological earthquake to all Roman citizens outside the senatorial class, the elite of the elite. It stripped away the last pretense that the Senate was the source of legitimacy. The Senate didn't make emperors. Swords made emperors. The Senate merely ratified the survivor. When Vespasian finally came out on top, he didn't want to rely on the vague authority that Augustus had used. He wanted it in writing. The Senate passed the Lex de Imperio Vespasiani, a brutal piece of legislation that codified the emperor's powers. It explicitly stated that the emperor had the right to do whatever he deemed necessary for the state, just as Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius had done. It was the final legal surrender. The Senate formally voted that the emperor was above the law in perpetuity, a privilege that hadn't even been reserved for dictators in the Republican days. It was a capitulation that codified the autocracy, leaving the Senate with nothing but its social prestige. The Senate would continue to exist for centuries after, providing a gilded cage for these rare and ancient birds to squawk and tweet. The status of the Roman Senate in the early empire is a study in the difference between form and substance. Formally, it was the sovereign power of Rome, the partner of the princeps, and the maker of laws. Substantially, it was a terrified, reactive body that existed to rubber stamp the decisions of a military autocrat. Ironically, since the common people enjoyed seeing these wealthy, disconnected aristocrats shamed, it was important for early emperors to portray senators as powerful. After all, a quick humiliation ritual conducted on the senatorial class was a surefire way to win back support from the masses of people who weren't ultra-rich oligarchs. Imagine, if you can, the sound of the wind cutting across a Somerset hill in the late 5th century. There's a distinct mechanical hissing, a terrifying serpentine shriek that rises above the thrum of hooves. This isn't magic, it's military technology. It's the sound of a Draco, a Roman cavalry standard with a hollow metal head and a silken tail, designed to catch the wind and scream as the rider charges. The leader of these men was King Arthur, but not the Arthur of high medieval romance, not the king in shining plate armor, living in a stone castle with stained glass windows. We're looking for the man behind the ghost, the Romano-British war leader, who stood in the ruins of the Roman Empire and fought for his concept of his civilization. To find him, we have to strip away the magic swords and the round tables and look at the very real Roman evidence from the British Dark Ages. In 410 AD, the traditional narrative says the Emperor Honorius wrote to the cities of Britain, telling them to look to their own defenses. The legions had gone, stripped away by usurpers like Constantine III to fight civil wars on the continent. Britain was left adrift. But the lights didn't go out immediately. We know now that Dark Age Britain was a place of frantic adaptation. The local aristocracy tried to keep the Roman way of life going in the cities and surrounding areas. They maintained the roads, they spoke Latin, and they drank wine when they could get it. But the economy had collapsed. The coinage stopped arriving. The pottery industries failed. The world became smaller, darker, and more local. Into this vacuum came the wolves. That's what the British monk Gildas called them, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Initially, they might have come as mercenaries, Federati invited by British tyrants like Vortigern to fight the Picts. It's a classic story. You hire the barbarians to fight the barbarians, and then the hired help realizes you can't pay them, so they take the house instead. The Saxons brought a different language, a different religion, and a different way of war. In many places, Britons and Saxons lived side by side. Yet, politically, the island was fracturing. The East was turning Germanic and pagan, while the West remained British, Christian, and desperately Roman. And if political collapse wasn't enough, the weather turned against them. We have evidence of severe environmental stress in this period. There were droughts in the late 4th century, followed by a general cooling. Crops failed. Resources were scarce. Our best window into the 6th century is that monk named Gildas that I mentioned. Writing around 540 AD, right in the shadow of the supposed Arthurian age, he wrote a polemic called On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. Gildas wasn't writing history, he was writing a sermon. He wanted to scream at the British petty kings and chieftains of his day for their sins. He lists the disasters that befell Britain, including the Saxon invasion and revolt. He mentions a great victory for the Britons, the siege of Mons Badonicus. He tells us this battle stopped the Saxon advance for a generation. He tells us it happened in the year of his own birth. But he doesn't mention Arthur. Not once. Instead, he praises a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. He calls Ambrosius the last of the Romans. He says he was a man of high birth whose parents had worn the purple implying imperial rank of some degree. To Gildas, Ambrosius is the savior, and according to some, this silence is damning. It potentially suggests that either Arthur didn't exist, or that Arthur is a later name given to the deeds of Ambrosius. Or still yet, it perhaps suggests Arthur was a general fighting under a king, and Gildas only cared about kings. Jump forward to the early 8th century. The Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon monk, writes his ecclesiastical history. He reads Gildas. He copies the bit about the battles. But again, no Arthur. To the Anglo-Saxons, this period was their heroic age of conquest. If there was a great British anti-king who slaughtered them by the thousands, they either didn't care to record his name, or perhaps they suppressed it. However, some believe that had such a heroic British king existed, they would have been very likely to publicize it. After all, the conquest of a powerful and mythic foe makes for a much better story than stomping out some disparate weaklings. The first potential name drop comes from a Welsh poem called Y Gododdin, which laments the death of warriors from the north. It talks about a great Welsh hero, and then mentions that, quote, "He was no Arthur," implying that Arthur was already a very well-known heroic leader at this time. The only problem with this is what "at this time" means in the context, and the poem itself has been dated anywhere from the early 7th century to the late 11th century. If it came from the early 7th century, this poem is an absolute bombshell that potentially adds to the historicity of Arthur as a great Roman warrior against Anglo-Saxon rule. If it comes from the 11th century, it's a reference to a very well-known and well-established legendary figure. In the 9th century, a Welsh monk named Nennius compiled the Historia Brittonum, and this is where the legend explodes. Nennius gives us the first biography of Arthur as a military commander, and I'm using the term biography loosely here, since it's more of a brief collection of deeds. Nennius lists 12 battles that Arthur fought. He calls him Dux Bellorum, leader of battles, not Rex, meaning king. He says Arthur fought alongside the kings of the Britons, implying he was a supreme commander of a coalition. This lack of reference to him as a king, but serving with rulers, suggests that he was a man chosen on the basis of his merit and ability, rather than on his bloodlines alone. The list is a logistical nightmare since many of the locations named don't correspond to any actual known locations. However, the locations that are known or likely known and the times between the battles imply that Arthur was active over decades and led a highly mobile fighting force. Historians can argue about texts all day, but the ground doesn't lie. In the last 50 years, archaeology has revolutionized our view of Arthur's Britain. We have found the places where the kings of this era lived, and they're spectacular in their own ways. They most certainly aren't the high medieval places we've heard about our whole lives, but they show a great degree of post-Roman sophistication. On the rugged coast of Cornwall lies Tintagel. For centuries, legend said this was where Arthur was conceived. Skeptics said it was just a remote monastery. They were wrong. Excavations in the 1990s and 2010s uncovered a massive quantity of imported pottery from the Mediterranean world. The lords here were drinking Byzantine wine and using olive oil, while the rest of Britain was sliding into subsistence. They were rich, powerful, and connected to the Roman world. Then, in 1998, they found the slate that would be dubbed by some the Arthur Stone. Scratched onto it were the Latin words, roughly translating to Artognu, father of a descendant of Coll, made this. Some have argued that this may have been a real reference to Arthur, though other historians argue that Arthur more likely comes from the Roman name Artorius. Even still, it indicates that there was a ruler at Tintagel in the 5th or 6th century with a name that sounded extremely similar to Arthur. If Tintagel was the palace, South Cadbury was the fortress. Located in Somerset, it's a massive Iron Age hill fort. But in the late 5th century, the Arthurian moment, someone did something incredible. They refortified it. They built a massive new defensive wall using Roman-style construction techniques. This required enormous labor. It implies a centralized authority, someone who could command hundreds of workers. Inside, archaeologists found the post holes of a great hall. This was a feasting hall for a post-Roman warband. Strategically, South Cadbury is perfect. It sits near the intersection of major Roman roads. If you had a mobile cavalry army and you wanted to intercept Saxon raiders coming from the east, this is exactly where you would put your base. It fits the description of Camelot as a military headquarters better than any other site in Britain by a good margin. But of course that brings us to main contenders under the theory that he was a Roman or a Romano-Briton, and there's 3 main candidates. The first is Lucius Artorius Castus. This theory suggests Arthur was actually a Roman commander from the 2nd century, not the 5th. Lucius Artorius Castus was a real historical figure, a prefect of the 6th Victrix Legion, stationed in Britain around 180 AD. In 175 AD, Emperor Marcus Aurelius sent 5,500 Sarmatian heavy cavalry to Britain. These warriors worshipped a sword thrust into the earth and carried dragon standards. Proponents argue that Artorius commanded them, and his legend grew over centuries until he was moved forward in time to the Saxon Wars. It's a compelling story, but the timeline is the problem. It requires a 300-year gap where oral tradition preserved his name perfectly while forgetting when he lived. Most historians think it's a stretch, and honestly I do too, so let's move on. Riothamus is a fascinating figure. He was a quote-unquote king of the Britons in the late 5th century, exactly the right time. We know he existed because he received letters from Sidonius Apollinaris, a Roman bishop and aristocrat. Riothamus led a British army of 12,000 men across the Channel into Gaul to help the Romans fight the Visigoths. This matches the legends of Arthur's involvement in France. Even more striking is his end. He was betrayed by a Roman official named Arvandu. Defeated, Riothamus retreated toward the Burgundian town of Avalon, and he was never seen again. A betrayed king returning to Avalon to die sounds almost too perfect, and some think the Arthur legend may actually just be the story of Riothamus. But the most likely candidate is the one Gildas actually names, Ambrosius Aurelianus. He fits the profile perfectly. A Romanized aristocrat, a unifier, the victor of the anti-Saxon campaigns. However, his name clearly isn't Arthur, though there is a suggestion that it could have been a nickname derived from Arctos, the Greek word for bear. This, of course, is a highly speculative jump, and there's no actual evidence to support this. At present, the historical consensus leans strong in favor of King Arthur being a historical Romano-British leader, in a sense. Someone organized that defense. Someone rallied the war bands. Someone stood on a hill in Somerset and ordered assaults on the Anglo-Saxons. It's likely that he was an amalgam of multiple figures, with Ambrosius Aurelianus providing most of the real-life military prowess associated with the legendary king. Hey everyone, thanks for watching, and just a quick reminder to click that share button and send this video to your friends and family. Also, consider buying a YouTube membership or joining the Patreon if you want to take your support for my work to the next level.